Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Capital Spotlight. Today, we are here with Robert Ordway, Senior Policy Advisor for Governor Braun. So you're out in Indiana now. You're out of the D.C. area. You were on the Senate side and now going out to Indiana and really getting down to it with the governor. How's that been so far?
Oh, well, first off, thanks for having me on the show. I've seen some other interviews, very impressed with all the folks that you've had on, some of the conversations that have been had. But anyway, big transition. I was out in Washington, D.C. for 8 years, and 6 of those were with then Senator Braun. And so kind of tried to quit every year. But I tell you what, when you have a boss as great as I do and a team that was put together, you're really fighting for the right mission. And I had some family members that kind of put their thumb on the scale about 8 months ago. And they said, hey, Robert, you've been out there long enough. You need to be closer to family. So when the then governor-elect, asked me to move home, I said it was kind of a no-brainer at that point. But it's been fun. I think one of the big differences between the federal and the state is that here there's no real deadlines, and the deadlines that exist, they sort of just blow through. State legislatures are way faster. And so for Indiana, we meet every year. We have what's called a long session, a budget session, and then we have a short session. And so there are about 1,200 bills that are filed, and you can imagine about 200 of those are going to become law. Yeah. So for 4 months, you've got to really keep your eye on the ball as it goes across the field. And so it's certainly a humbling exercise. The policy's not quite as complex, but I tell you what, it's certainly a different game to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely want to dive into that more. But first, tell us about who you are. Like, where'd you come from? What's kind of your experience to get where you are today?
Yeah, well, I was actually born in a naval hospital in Virginia. Most people don't know that, but both my mom and dad were born and raised in Gary, Indiana, and I was raised in what's called Lake Station, formerly East Gary. It's we call it kind of the urban fringe or what have you, but had a very blue collar upbringing. Dad and granddad were steel workers, and have a lot of heritage behind that kind of work ethic and ethos and things of that nature. But I was supposed to go to the war in Iraq back in 2003 when I graduated high school. And I was signed up as what they call a DEP, the Delayed Entry Program. So even though I signed the paperwork at 17, you can't legally contract at that age. And so this thing called the Eli Lilly Endowment scholarship was started in the mid-'90s. And so I happened to be very lucky and ended up getting that scholarship in 2003, And that put my life on a different trajectory because it was a 4-year full tuition right to anywhere in Indiana. And the reason why Lilly created it is because we've been a state historically with a brain drain. So instead of going to the war in Iraq, went to college, graduated with a degree in finance in December '07. If you look on Wikipedia or Google, you'll find that December '07 is the month that the Great Recession started. And so my dad always said, if you work hard and you're honest, you'll be successful. And I remember I was going through 2008 and I was like, I think my late dad lied to me, but the reality was, the financial sector had contracted so much. And so, spent all of '08 kind of wandering in the wilderness and started studying housing policy to understand this whole thing called the Great Recession. And next thing you know, I fell into grad school, getting a degree in international commerce and policy, interned for the mayor and then the state rep. And sort of like the Godfather 3, politics is something where every time I try to get out, they drag me back in. And so was kind of in around city, county, state stuff. And 8 years ago, came out here to D.C. and kind of the rest is history. But it's been certainly an interesting journey and not linear at all in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I can imagine. But hey, I started in startups about laundry, moved to the Hill, and now back to startups about politics. It's like wherever the Lord takes you, like it all kind of works out, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about your upbringing. I know that it was super important to you. You're from the fake Steel City. I'm from the real Steel City.
Whoa.
But, that's a
Shots
whole different
fired.
story. But still, tell us about your upbringing there.
Yeah, well, I think something's really unique. It's taken me years to kind of synthesize this, but growing up in the 90s, Gary, Indiana was the murder capital of the nation. And we were told that regularly through TV and the newspaper. And, Michael Jordan was doing really well. The Bulls were crushing it. I decided to be an Orlando Magic fan. My dad thought that was dumb. Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway were a thing, right?
Yeah, fair.
But something for me is, Gary's the first city in the nation, along with Cleveland, to have a first black mayor during the Civil Rights Movement. And it has a unique racial history and legacy. And so as a kid, my favorite athletes, musicians, actors were all black. But then when I went with my dad into Gary to help one of his Hungarian friends build a house, I saw drug dealers and prostitutes in broad daylight. And this is 96, 97, and so I saw kind of the 1% and then the other 1% at the other end. And so it started to plant the seeds of maybe a lifelong investigation into multi-ethnic, multiracial working class issues. And so having that upbringing is very unique. And I think Pittsburgh, you could say, has many similarities to Gary, where, in the late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, a lot of Eastern Europeans, Greeks, Slav, Polish, Croatian. I mean, Gary from 1906 to 1921 had 50 plus ethnicities.
Jeez, that's crazy.
And William A. Wirt was the first superintendent. So can you imagine running a school system and having 50 people that can't talk to each other? Mostly male, mostly poor, religious, political exiles, people looking for economic opportunity. And how do you educate them? And what's the goal of education, really? But then, we had the Emergency Quota Act in 1921 that, stopped a lot of the immigration. U.S. Steel went down and grabbed Southern blacks and whites. And then Inland Steel, which was founded by a Jewish family, they went down during the Great Steel Strike in 1919 and grabbed Mexicans. And so some people say Northwest Indiana is a melting pot. Others would say it a salad bowl. Sometimes the mixing hasn't always worked historically, but I think it gives you a unique perspective on blue collar, working class issues, but kind of the intersectionality of organized labor, race, which really dials into ultimately civil rights, women's rights, and other unique things. So I think being 40 years old, like the vice president, we grew up in a time that we're old enough to know better, but young enough to be relevant to technology. Yeah. So I think they call us elder millennials. We actually know what rotary phones are. Yeah, exactly. And I had was it cassettes growing up until CDs, sixth grade or whatever. And actually, I got triggered by Facebook the other day. I saw a 5 1/4 floppy. And I was like, I'm glad we don't have those anymore. So, but yeah, I think my upbringing is Northwest Indiana is a very eclectic area of the state, but gives, I think, a lot of insights into not just where we're from, but where we're going as a country.
Yeah, and I think that I do believe this kind of starts in Pittsburgh and works its way west in the Midwest, but that Rust Belt area and just like that classic working class environment that you grow up in, like what were some things that stood out to you that you really appreciated about that community?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in the church. I think I went maybe 10 times. My mom gave it a few college tries here and there. And so that led to another lifelong investigation in terms of like, why was my dad such a stickler on certain issues? Being not terribly religious. And so one of the kind of the threads, and I look at my high school as a really great example. So during the mid-late 50s, you had a lot of Southern whites and some Mexicans in what we call the second wave migration. And my grandparents lived in the west side of Gary for a couple of years, the east side of Gary, and then they ultimately bought in East Gary, which is now Lake Station. And they bought the house in which I grew up in. And one of the things that is interesting to me about that upbringing is that, both Hobart and Lake Station High School were busting at the seams. And they're like, we can't take anybody. And interesting enough, my grandmother was the last to go to Evans Elementary where I went, and she went to Hobart High School. She was the last to do that, where everybody else going forward went to River Forest. So they throw up this school kind of in a rush. They're like, what do we call it? Well, it's next to a river, next to a forest. We'll call it River Forest. What's the mascot? It's an ingot, which is a block of steel, right? Which we haven't made ingots in Northwest Indiana at least since I believe 2001. We use something called continuous caster. So you basically take the molten steel and you kind of roll it right into a slab and then ultimately a coil, depending on what the use is or what have you. So the River Forest ingots, our mascot is Joe Makarak, which is a mythical folklore Croatian immigrant steel hero that can, basically bend, steel with his hands and all this kind of neat stuff. So my community it's between Gary, New Chicago, Hobart, and Lake Station. And so since there was no downtown, the school has always been the center of the community. And one of the things I noticed since I graduated college is looking at the Department of Education data, given how poor they are, their test scores don't align with that. They always what I call outperform their poverty. And that's why I think the key point here is that just because you grow up without money or resources, however you define that, it's really not an excuse not to say please and thank you. It's not an excuse to not show up on time or have good work ethic. And I think my dad and even maybe the broader community instilled those values that, at the end of the day, it's not where you come from, it's where you're going that really matters. And I take a lot of pride in kind of that hard scrabble upbringing. I think it creates a little bit of resiliency, to say the least. So
yeah, for sure. And obviously, when you graduate at the recession time, like you need a little resiliency in your life.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so growing up that way, getting to DC and a very different environment now, like how do you feel like you've been able to bring that mindset or that upbringing with you, and like how's it translated to, well, let's say you're still in DC for the sake of this question.
Are you asking kind of how DC has molded my views? Or
How did your views like impact your work here? Like how did that make you a better staffer? How did that integrate you better into the DC culture?
Yeah, I think if I were going to give some old man advice here related to young folks, there's kind of a pipeline of, hey, I'm a poli-sci major, might want to go to law school. Intern on Capitol Hill, which is usually your best bet to try to get a job, because I think a lot of folks don't understand that, if the economy grows, Goldman Sachs grows, they're going to hire people from the Ivy League schools. There are a finite number of positions on Capitol Hill, despite the country growing bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Only so many members, so much budget, et cetera. So the competition for the jobs is fierce, right? But the thing is that folks come in as interns, you're 22, you're young and impressionable, and I think the system can kind of mold you in a way that may not be true to your value system, I think, in the long haul. And coming to Capitol Hill, I think I was 33 when I started, and so my habits, good or bad, and there's plenty of bad ones out there, were already kind of molded. And I would say also my kind of religious convictions and values were already kind of locked in. And so there were certain principles, and luckily for me, my boss has those same convictions where we just have some non-negotiables that are out there. And so I think that informed me as it relates to being able to, advocate for the principle at the same time while not compromising any of your own values. And I think it's a little tougher if you're on the House side, where you're in a little bit of a survival of the fittest environment. You have, maybe a moderate member of Congress on either side of the aisle that's constantly having to navigate, good public policy, but, obviously a lot of those folks want to get reelected, so they have to figure out what their comm strategy is. And so as we bifurcate the two parties, it makes it harder for sometimes common sense to prevail. But I think for young people, one of the key things is that you only get one reputation, when you shake someone's hand. And this is a very small town. Everybody knows everybody. And so I think it's important to set the stage right out of the gate and do the best you can. And I think, additionally, I think a lot of folks, politics becomes their religion here, even if it's not, where they start to worship work. And I think God has called us. I don't believe in the word careers. In my interview with AF this past week, I don't believe in careers. I think career is a secular ladder climbing exercise to acquire title, money, status, and all this other nonsense. I believe in vocation. I think God has called us to do something to serve other people. And it's not something we worship, though, either. And I think it's easy out here to get kind of in that rabbit hole of, well, I've got to work 16 hours a day, and just saying, no, don't get me wrong. I know there are moments like during reconciliation where I had to pull all-nighters. And as someone who likes to go to bed at, 9:30, 10, those were took a lot of Celsius, Red Bull, and other chemicals. That's not fun. But, I think people have to understand here as professionals, you have to have work-life balance. You have to prioritize your faith, if that's important to you, your family, and ultimately your community. Because if you get swallowed up by the politics of this place, I think it can lead you into some dark places.
As someone who has kind of gone in a zigzag to make your way here, what was that process of finding your vocation? Like how would you recommend it for a 23-year-old coming out of school, like myself at the time, who had no idea what I wanted to do? And it was like, how do you realize, oh, this is the thing I'm called to do?
Yeah, so one leg of my stool, I think, maybe a little bit secular. So I think it's, what are you passionate about? The other be, what are you actually good at? Sometimes those actually aren't the same thing. I mean, I love music, but I'm not as good as I used to be at playing guitar. And then what in the secular piece are like, what's the market commanding to? I think you need to, you're probably a little bit of a high-level risk taker that a true entrepreneur doesn't really know what risk is, so they just jump off the cliff and they're like, you know what, I'm going to flap my wings and see what happens, right?
Yeah.
Takes a certain real leap of faith, but I do believe that, let's say college is for you and you think you're going to do this thing. I mean, you need to think about a degree that you're passionate about, but there has to be some element of marketability here, right? I mean, gender, underwater basket weaving sounds kind of neat, but if there's a market of one for the job and it's the PhD who's teaching the job to create a PhD to teach the job, probably should reconsider that. So I think folks need to kind of look at that three-legged stool in a sense of, what are you called to do? What are you passionate? If it feels like work every single day, then you might be in the wrong spot. And I said this in a panel, gosh, must have been 5 years ago. I said because I was overextended, I was sitting on 5 boards at once, which I don't advocate. I think one of the key things of any leaders, you have to be able to say no, because when you're good at something or you're loyal and hardworking, it's not that people will take advantage of you. It's just that when you do good, they give you more work, right?
For sure.
And I remember being back in Valparaiso and being overwhelmed by my volunteering activities. And kind of the benchmark for me is when your passions become obligations, that is when you have to hit the hard pause button, step back and reassess what's your why, what's the mission, what's the goal. Because if you're stressed out, like I was, like, oh, I got to raise money for this nonprofit, or I've got to do this political campaign thing, or do that, and you're just like, well, why am I stressed out? If I really love these things, why am I stressed out about it? So I think that's a huge indicator for folks to know if they're, not just if they're on the right path, but definitely if they're on the wrong path.
Yeah, for sure. I feel you. And that's like, no matter how intentional you are about that stuff, it'll creep itself up over and over and over again. And so I think a few of those points like that, especially, and then the whole like making or worshiping work, like it's so easy to fall into those, especially in this town, because it's overwhelming. There's so much you have to do.
And I think too, and this is a little bit of epiphany from a few weeks ago, maybe shower thoughts, but because there are no real deadlines here, the media really drives the day, right? If some bad, X thing happens in San Francisco or New York or somewhere in between, that's going to be the news that they're going to interview senators from. If a senator has a cure for cancer, sorry, that's not our topic du jour today. We don't care. Whereas in the States, because bills are moving, the media actually has to respond by actual actions of elected officials. So it's a little bit of a different cadence there. But, I will say some of the challenge, and I think Bill Clinton was the first president that had to endure the evolving 24-hour media cycle where, like, when the Bay of Pigs happened with JFK, it's like, all right, we got time to think about how we're going to respond to this.
Sure.
And so now with all the technology that wasn't around when I was growing up, it's so easy to be plugged into the matrix, and it's sort of, I tell you what, bless comms people. I mean, us policy people are on when we're on, and we're off when we're off. Comms people have to be plugged into the matrix because they never know when their boss is going to get a call and have to respond to this super esoteric thing or whatever. And so they sort of do have to be on 24/7. And I think there's a certain, how do you, if you want to get married, have kids, buy a home, whatever your definition of the American dream. If you're a comms director, how do you figure out how to, where's the off button at, right?
I was just having that conversation this morning of like, it was so hard being on the Hill, and if your team is in power, then it's rah-rah, everything's great. If your team isn't in power, then everything is wrong, everything is negative.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of
just
like
bomb throwing.
And add that into...
You don't even need a policy team, just all comms team.
And add that into the never-ending news cycle. And I always joked, like, I can walk to the Hill and know who a policy staffer is and know who a comms staffer is, because a policy staffer can just walk from Navy Yard to the Hill without anything. You just show up to work. You don't have to bring your work home with you. Whereas the comms staffer has a backpack with the laptop in it at all times, because you have to have that computer on you. And I hated that. I'm like, I just want to leave work at work and come home, and never really got that on the Hill.
Don't kid yourself. Us policy people, there's no shortage of CRS reports to read on some, again, esoteric, weird, and I'm going to call myself a former budget staff, right? I plan to speak, and I know the governor plans to continue to lead on related to, debt deficits, fiscal issues, but I can tell you that the budget is so inherently legalistic and challenging that many times I did go home to try to learn something new about it. And there's this document called the Circular 11. It's what OMB essentially uses to run the federal government. And you never know if there's like 10 different words that means spend money. I'm hoping that, a future wife doesn't learn what those things are because, so there's no shortage of things to learn. But I would agree with you that, when you're on the policy side, there is a easier ability to divorce yourself from some of the 24/7 action.
Yeah, it's like once the team walks off the floor, it's over for the day, right?
Yeah.
Like there's nothing to respond to immediately. You're not going to,
Yeah.
all of a sudden I have to do this thing. And I just remember I was a comm staffer at the time, but when RBG died, it was like a Friday night and like probably 7, 8 o'clock at night. And we were at Dacha Navy Yard with some friends, and you just see everyone pulling out their phones and like typing on their phones. And it's all these people writing statements because it's like the news doesn't stop. Your boss is going to want a statement. And all of a sudden on Friday night, you're having to write about RBG.
Yeah. And you also wonder, how much do you have to respond? I think, because of the technology and media, your boss has to have an opinion on everything all the time, which is not really how most humans operate in society. Like, do I have opinions about, abortion or unions or whatever? Sure, but I don't wake up every day thinking about that stuff per se. And I think, once you're elected, it's like you're going to get those questions 24/7. You've got to figure out, what your position is. But the challenge is that there's no room for nuance anymore either. It's, you do an interview or a clip, and as much as I love X, former Twitter, everything's always going to be cut down and turned into this hyper soundbite. And I think it's sort of it's unfortunate because it's very anti-intellectual in my mind. And I'm not saying I'm a smart guy, but we need to have some full thoughts here. It's much like the Bible, right? You can cherry pick any verse and bend it to your will, but you need to look at it in the context of the book and in the entire book, right? And understand the time of the day and maybe the politics and cultural issues or economic issues, and versus again that one little blip doesn't really tell you a whole lot.
For sure. So, as someone who holds their boss in very high regards, been with them for a long time, what is it like working with someone that doesn't necessarily come from the policy background, but someone who's entrepreneur focused, and like how does that mindset translate to being a good boss in politics?
Yeah, I kind of compare this to my favorite author, historically Nassim Taleb. Wrote 5 New York Times bestsellers, super financially successful, and has a really keen understanding of like complex adaptive systems is what they would call it. And even though, the governor doesn't have that same educational background, went to some undergrads in, economics, and then he got an MBA. He is extremely sharp. I think one of the most impressive things when I was, running the budget committee for him is that he wouldn't read his binder the night before. And then during the committee, the witnesses are speaking, and he's reading his binder, and he's dual processing. And then when they're done, he's asking a question that's pretty deep in the weeds. And so I think it's nice to work for someone, and maybe not so nice sometimes, where it's like you say something he's not going to forget, which means and I'll tell you, when he came back and had questions, as someone who's very, very good at economics and took a business from zero to hero, over the course of almost 40 years, he really has that. He has the policy team like us to get in the weeds for him, but he digests things very quickly, and he's able to use kind of that creative entrepreneurial acumen where, government fundamentally, and I hate to beat on lawyers, but, government's very top-down, centralized, static. Humans fundamentally are dynamic, right? Think of electrons or anything in the galaxy is highly, highly dynamic, right? So you want to have as much bottom-up pressure. I think the Charles Koch Institute would call it spontaneous order and creative destruction, right? And the governor, his entrepreneurial ethos is in that same way, where it's like, okay, like we need more bottom-up, more creative. Like we're trying to get from A to B. We can't have all these overly strings or one-size-fits-all kind of things. And so I think he's just very, as intelligent as he's super receptive to ideas, very good thinker. And again, he's got his own strong convictions about certain things. But I mean, one of the key things about him and even our staff at large, and why we had I wouldn't call it virtually zero turnover over 6 years, but I would be willing to put money on it that we had the least amount of turnover that we would be number one for least amount of turnover in the 6 years that he was there. And that's because we have a super high level of trust. People on the staff have different religious, political worldviews of all kinds.
Yeah.
We had a lot of arguments in the office, but at the end of the day, we understood the importance of coexisting and working for the principle. And I think you get such better work product when you can have maybe you call radical transparency with staff, where you're not worried about people running to HR because someone upset somebody, or somebody's trying to move in on someone else's policy area and backstab them, which I know is a thing on the Hill. There's again a certain level of survival of the fittest, as I mentioned earlier. But Braun is such a individual that he really has the right mentality for the job, and you got to have thick skin from the political side, but also he doesn't. I think when you're retired and financially secure like he is, it really allows you to dedicate 110% of yourself to the job. Now, the challenge is there's almost 7 million Hoosiers, and he wants to meet all of them. And we're like, we call him Mike, and he's like, Mike, like, that you're a math guy. That math doesn't math. So, but I mean, that guy, I tell you what, he's a human being that doesn't have a bad bone in his body, and leads with conviction, and it's easy to wake up every day. I'm serving someone like that for sure.
That's great. And I think the more we can encapsulate that on the Hill, the better, right? Like creating office environments that last, and cultivating a culture that isn't incentivizing like pay upgrades or like getting that next title bump or whatever, but really focusing on a mission. I think that's great to see. I mean, obviously we wish every single office was like that, but everyone has different intentions.
Well, and it's harder now financially, right?
Yeah,
I mean, when
sure.
I moved to DC, January of 17, Navy Yard was basically a mud hole filled with cranes. And when I got a job at the American Legislative Exchange Council, I ended up moving over to Crystal City because the metro is great as a tourist. If you have to use it every day, especially outside of rush hour, it could be a little challenging. So I ended up moving to Crystal City. It was a lot closer to work. And then when I started working for then Senator, then it was the opposite. I was like, I can't deal with this. So then I moved to Capitol Hill. But through the gentrification of the city, I know the house has a pay floor now. I believe it's $45,000.
I missed that one.
Yeah.
As soon as I left the Hill to like quit my job, be an entrepreneur, be so freaking broke, and then they raised the pay floor, and I'm like,
maybe they were waiting for you to leave.
Yeah, probably. They're probably happy.
But the thing about the challenge, I mean, here, we're sitting here in Navy Yard where I lived for 6 months in 17, and then came back during COVID, August of 20. So I lived here basically 4.5 years, and in one of the older buildings, and by old, that's 15 years old essentially here. But all the new buildings, I mean, you're looking at studios that are 23 to 2,500 bedrooms, almost 2,800, 2 bedrooms, 4,500. I mean, again, the math don't math. And so how do you, if we want to build institutional knowledge with Capitol Hill staffers and better serve their members, you got to have what Brent's company, time on the Hill, right? That you really need that, but all the incentives are misaligned now. Where they say don't leave the Hill unless you can make like double your salary. So if you come in at 45, you're kind of literally worth 90 the next day if you go be some backbencher for some lobbying shop or a trade association. Well, we come back to the whole: if you want to get married, have kids, and buy a house, it's a math problem, and so. How do we develop, land use, housing, zoning policy here on Capitol Hill where people don't have to bus in or live out in Fairfax and take the Orange Line an hour, as if the job's not stressful enough? I can't imagine riding a train for an hour one way every day, or driving in. I mean, there's only one highway that gets you into the city, so that's a bit of a cluster in its own right.
Yeah, for sure.
Hence why I rode my bike to work for 6 years. So,
that's just so frustrating. And when I started on the Hill, my first job, to be staff and press assistant, I was making $32K. And it's like, yeah, sure, I can be loyal to a team, I can love the team, but if that's what you're going to pay me, I have to focus on myself, right? Like, I need to go get my next job ASAP. And so that's what I did. And like, I had worked in like the real world for a year before becoming an intern, so I felt entitled to like make more and more quickly. But you can't live on that. Like, it was so hard. There was no extra money.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, one of the things that I, respected, again, I get the whole, you've got to earn your, young people have to earn their stripes, et cetera, or you're paying it forward to be some wealthy lobbyist, or whatever path these folks, want to go on. But one of the things that I did appreciate about then Senator Vance is that he was here for, all of 2 years. And, obviously everyone's salaries are public, but his legislative assistants were making 6 figures, senior policy advisor, 150, 160. And his chief and legislative director were actually under the 200,000. They're actually And so I thought there was something to be said for somebody who's paying their people well. But I can tell you, on a Friday, the Braun staff was pretty busy throughout the 6 years. Towards the end, not so much when he was transitioning, but I'll say that the Vance staff on a Friday at 5 o'clock, they were all still there, grinding away. And so, my late dad would say about Craftsman tools and basic things in life, son, you get what you pay for. Yeah. And so there's something to be said that if you pay an LA 6 figures, like, you're going to usually get some pretty, the expectation is high, but this place is filled with a lot of talented people and they're willing to grind. But if you pay them 32, and they leave you in 6 months or less, like, you can't get upset about it because 35 is a big percentage increase in Washington, D.C. when you got 3 roommates at 25 years old. So
yeah, for sure. So taking this in another direction, because I really want to make sure we hit this, but tell us about your book. Tell us where you're at in that process. What is it about first off? Then we can dive into the details.
Man, this has been it's funny. It's been a kind of a lifelong exercise. So I got on my iCloud and did some, essentially I call it naked searches. And I actually found some Word documents where I actually started working on things in 2004. And then I had something from 2006. My dad passed away in 2003. So I would say those wounds were somewhat fresh in many ways. And so this has been a long evolution where the story was like, hey, my dad's battle with ALS was so painful over 5 years when I was 13, 18 that I want to write a book about this. But again, there was no assistive technologies. There were no support groups. ALSA existed, but they were only in big cities. And so it was a very lonely, warlike experience where you just kind of bottle up all those emotions. And to me, writing the book at that time, 20 years ago, was much more about therapy than anything else to, share with people what happens when you bottle things up and how unhealthy it is, and then what are the unintended consequences through relationships with the other parent or siblings, romantic relationships. This thing, festers in unique ways over the course of time. But, as more famous people, more popular people have been diagnosed with ALS, obviously the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge 11 years ago really put the disease on the map, some money in the coffers. Now the federal government funds it through DOD research. So I felt like that story, particularly about ALS, is no longer my story to be told. Yeah. Instead of focusing on how my dad died, I want to focus on how he lived. So that's where the book kind of took a different direction as it relates to, again, I mentioned earlier that I didn't grow up religious. I think going through an exercise like that without faith is a very hard exercise, and I don't recommend it for anyone. But the book has really become, and Vance has this in his where, mine was originally like about ALS, adversity, and the American dream. And you see that as an undercurrent in hillbilly elegy. And so mine's got a little bit of a parallel in that space. But talking about blue collar, working class people, where did my dad's values come from? And, I started studying Southern migration and these unique parallels and commonalities between Southern blacks and whites and how neither were accepted in different ways in the North, and how that value system helped me pursue and overcome the adversity that was there. And I've got real deep reservations today about how we went from a culture of honor to a culture of dignity, now to a culture of victimhood, where it's always someone else's fault. The government owes me something. And, it's a terrible message that we send to young people, that because maybe the color of their skin or their gender or whatever, that they can never realize the American dream, however they define it. And so I think, my dad, I just remember in the late stages of ALS, I had a D on my permanent record in chemistry. And he basically said, my disease is not an excuse for poor performance.
Yeah.
Like, here's my dad on, the 18th hole of life, sped up to 9. And, sometimes I think I wish he would have had a little bit more soft touch, but that's how his convictions were. Yeah. It's like, so I put adversity in the context of my dad's 5-year battle. And so anything that happens to me, it's kind of a drop in the bucket, and I hope to get other people to understand that, hey, we all have challenges and things that we didn't sign up for. My barbell coach always calls it, involuntary hardship. The reason why we barbell lift, which is voluntary hardship, putting 350 pounds on your back, not the funnest thing on earth sometimes, but I tell you what, it rewires your psychology. When you do hard things, kind of getting the Teddy Roosevelt ethos,
For sure.
right? It helps prepare you for when the hard times come. It's not going to say they're going to be any easier, but your ability to be, as Taleb would say, anti-fragile, not just resilient, but actually get stronger from that process through the forging, of the fire. Good example there. I think that's really key. And so the book is going to be about, the multi-ethnic, multiracial working class where I came from, much more of a unifying story about people in, Northwest Indiana, and obviously my family from Western Kentucky that, that place, Western Kentucky, has never had anything. And, there were 8 million Appalachians, there were 6 million blacks, but nobody talks about these other 12 million whites that they call flatlanders. And they were called hillbillies because of popular culture, and they had a southern dialect, twang, et cetera, et cetera. But, Eastern Kentucky is, Scotch-Irish moonshiners. Western Kentucky is teetotaler Baptist wasps. And I didn't know this growing up. It finally clicked, after, long after my dad had passed away. But much like J.D. Vance, I went to visit my parents grandparents every single summer until I was 12. And we'd stop in Evansville just before going over the Ohio River, and my dad would get like 10 cases of Busch Light. And so it's about another hour to Crittenden County. And it was my job to put them in this cellar underneath the porch. And so I'm thinking, ultimately I went through DARE and, drugs are bad, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, man, does my grandfather have like a drinking problem? Well, you fast forward, and one, it was payment for taking care of me for 3-4 weeks in the summer, right? But then also, Western Kentucky, most of it was dry up until about 2019. So Crittenden County in particular was dry before Prohibition. They tried to go wet for like 4 years after Prohibition. They're like, well, we can't handle this. And so they went back dry until 2019. There's one single liquor store in the whole county. But Western Kentucky has this unique agrarian, I'm not FDR's biggest fan, but if it wasn't for him, the electoral cooperative grants and some of the WPA, obviously you've got land between the legs. It's very, he did a little bit of eminent domain that still bothers people to this day down there. But that part of the nation was it was the Western frontier for a long time. Yeah. And during the Great Depression, if it weren't for some federal government funding, parts of Crittenden County didn't have electricity till the 1950s. My grandfather's second cousin is still alive, and he was like, his name's Bruce, and he's up north now. He spends his summers in Florida. There was no hospital, born at home, no HVAC, Aladdin lamps to light. You had an outhouse, and you were basically living in a primitive civilization. And that's really when my grandfather got back from the Korean War. It was a little bit better than that, but it was so basic and primitive, and the wages were so much better that it was like, I have to find a better life. And that's how he went up Route 41. They call it one of the hillbilly highways. There's a book out there called Hillbilly Highway. It's a good read, but that's how he got to Gary, Indiana for U.S. Steel around 1957. So coming back to the book, it's really just trying to bring all that kind of together, but it's been a heavy lift.
Yeah,
it's a heavy lift.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. You're not just telling a story, right? There's so much historical, so many historical aspects that you have to bring into the whole thing and truly understand to create the narrative around that. So that is no easy task.
So nothing but time.
Yeah, with all your time.
Because there's plenty of that, right?
Yeah, for sure. Tell us a little bit more about the logistics of creating a book, right? So you develop your outline of where you want to take this thing, you write, what's the process? Where are you at in the process now? How did you get here?
Yeah, so been kind of stagnant for the last 6 months because of session, but I will say, so I want to write a book, right? Well, I recommend buying maybe a couple books that say about how to get published. So you have to originally think, do I want to self-publish, which, the world's your oyster, do whatever you want, very entrepreneurial, use Amazon, hire contractors for marketing, or do I want a traditional publishing deal, which again, from a timeline perspective, way longer.
For sure.
So, it's, I think 3 concepts. It's why this book, the subject, why me? Why am I the authoritative voice to write this book? And ultimately, what publisher will know is why now? How is this timely? Why are people going to buy it? Because, it's 99% of book sales are by 1% of books. It's definitely a barbell in a sense of so many books never sell 100 copies or whatever. Yeah. So the thing is, the industry's been consolidated by private equity. You've only got a few publishers, several imprints. So if you decide to go the public the traditional publishing route that I'm pursuing, you have to say, okay, why is a book agent going to talk to you and you're nobody, right? You're just a regular person. How are you going to scale this message? A lot of people think that, J.D. Vance he captured lightning in a bottle. Maybe. Timing is everything. I always use this analogy. C.S. Lewis died the same day that JFK was killed. Had he died, since he was literally the last page of the paper. His obituary is like, hey, great Christian thinker, next, right? Yeah. Had he died the day before, he would have been on the front pages globally as a one of the most preeminent Christian thinkers. So my point is, timing is everything when it comes to a book release date, the topic, and what have you. And so, in the traditional publishing scheme, the book proposal is your roadmap. It is your business plan. And I've got book proposals from Ed Lattimore, got a really good book deal. Rob Henderson, who wrote Troubled, was a national bestseller last year. Carrie Sheffield, who wrote Motorhome Prophecies. You've got, I'm trying to think of some others, but I've got about 10 book proposals by other what I call millennials that are writing about trauma or whatever. One of the unique things is most of them all have Ivy League degrees and have a built-in strong network. But I will say that their book proposals are radically different. And that's always been the challenge, is that as a math guy, I'm always looking for 2 + 2 = 4. How does the spreadsheet sum? Yeah. And in writing with agents and publishers, they're all looking for something different. Someone want to know that I have 85,000 words in a draft. Others are like, oh my gosh, don't tell anybody that, right? But the cool thing is I have a tool called Scrivener. It's about $80. They call themselves, I think, the anti-word processor. But what's neat about it is that I try to do the Ryan Holiday thing with, read books, take notes on note cards, index them, get all your thoughts together, and then organize those thoughts into chapters and really kind of build out this infrastructure for the book, right? Scrivener allows you to basically use like an outline, note cards, and a corkboard, rearrange things. If you're doing a novel, you can like find quotes of all your characters, and you can see if their personas consistent, or or that you use the same words. So for $80, this tool has really, I used to sit every Saturday for 8 hours at the Library of Congress. I mean, I would literally, lift weights, eat, and then go there. One of the cool things about a Hill staffer, you take your badge, you go in your own entrance, you go right to the main reading room, and I would put on my AirPod Maxes and just lock in for 8 hours every Saturday for, gosh, I want to say almost a year.
I miss access to that place so badly.
Yeah, and then you see, you feel like it's interesting too, because all the guests, right, that are doing tours are up there, and you feel almost like a farm animal down there. I mean, they're pointing at you. You're like, what's the guy doing?
It's like inspirational to sit there too, and like to look up when you're like needing some extra help, and to take in all of that and to like understand the magnificence of that place. Yeah. It's just that's actually where I first wrote the business plan for Connect.
Really?
So, yeah.
Oh, that's too cool.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, quiet space, unlimited resources. I mean, every Capitol Hill staffer needs to take advantage of that. And one of the neat thing is, other than original manuscripts, you have essentially kind of the same power as a member of Congress, and can have anything delivered right to your desk at your office, which that's pretty neat. So, but anyway, back to business plan proposal. I've seen some that are, very short on the front end, and it's like 90% social media, like strategy. They call it, what's your platform? How many followers? How are you going to deploy this? Others, it's really just the emotional. It's they call it the hook. Yeah. You got one sentence. If I like one sentence, give me one paragraph. If I like one paragraph, give me one page. All right, after one page, let me see your real sample writing. Show me that you've got the skill set to really pull this off. So where I'm at in the process is that, I had a gal edit my book proposal, but it kind of came out a little too Christian self-help. And that's not really, again, you have to identify who's your primary audience, maybe a secondary or an alternative audience. I know with the book, the original Christian masculinity book, John Eldridge's Wild at Heart, what Yates and Yates discovered that, even the book was written to men, by men, for men. Like the number one purchasers of it was actually women, because it was sold in Christian bookstores. But like, hey, my husband or my son, they would benefit. And actually, a girl that I dated in high school, her mom worked at, was it called Family Christian Bookstore? It was in Maryville. Anyway, she bought me that book when I was 18, and it was kind of interesting because it resonated with me. But I didn't, my dad had just passed away, and I didn't really internalize it. But I read it again a few years ago. But that's a good example of, you really got to know who your audience is. And you've got to show your agent that just like think tankers, they write a white paper, but you have an audience of 5, right? They're all going to read it. You're going to have a 100% saturation rate, but from a volume and ultimately profitability perspective, there's nothing there. And so what I'm doing right now is, I think Rob Henderson's he's been so helpful. Him and Ed Lattimore, they're both my age. Now, we did a Zoom, and, that's what inspired me to start the Substack. I've got about 15,000 people reading it per post. So I take pieces of the book and then I rework into maybe a shorter story. Cool. There's still like 2,500 words. I put some pictures in. I kind of use it as a little bit of a testing ground to see, are people interested in my personal stories? Does it have a hook? And then, refine it. And so using that to really build an audience to show agents and publishers that, I've got a tiger by the tail in some capacity. But then in order to, using that to rework the book proposal to be a little more focused on, working class, multi-ethnic, racial type issues. And I'm going to be a speaker at, it's not public yet, but TEDx Gary.
There we go. We broke news.
Yeah.
We broke news.
Yeah. Don't worry. No one's going to watch this, right? So, but I want to, I want to talk about the Southern diaspora and our shared history. And I think that's going to be a unique piece. So again, I think there's just some fun things that are very parallel to Vance, but again, we're from 2 very different. Middletown, Ohio is not Gary, Indiana, other than having a steel mill. But really getting that book proposal, I talked to, Javelin DC, Athos, some of the best PR. What you find out is that the best agents are actually marketing PR agencies that have substantial relationships, because the key is, okay, Robert, you're going to get 200 copies as part of the production that the publisher is going to kick back to you. Who are you going to give those to for free? Yeah. Are they going to write about, who are their audience? Like a Tyler Cowen, Mercatus Center, right? He's got millions of followers. That person, give him a book, and you get on his podcast. Sure. So really being able to, build out the infrastructure, and that's where those companies come in, because a lot of them are former Capitol Hill staffers, veterans, or they worked in the president's office or VPs. And so they can pick up a phone to a Fox News or a CNN or some, rag on Capitol Hill. Because when I think about writing a book, you have to understand that like 70% of the nation's communications, like just on the aggregate, come out of Washington, D.C. You might have thousands of local affiliates and, your Weather Channel, whatever. But at the end of the day, all the noise comes out of here. Yeah. So if you're going to sell a book, you really need to leverage your relationships from here, because that's what the Google SEO likes. That's just where the algorithm, that's where everything's driven out of. And so being able to live out here like I did, build out the networking and infrastructure, I think is my kind of strength, is that I'll have the folks I need in my corner who are willing to advocate on my behalf to help sell the book. But I'll tell you, it's even if you do get a deal, let's say your agent gets you a deal, you've got a date for original manuscript deadline, usually between 3 to 6 months. And then even from the manuscript deadline, usually the publication's a year later. Yeah, so I used to put a lot of pressure on myself, but I think the topic of multi-ethnic, multiracial working class, and some of the political realignments not changing. Again, my book's not meant to be political, but it is my lived experience.
I think like anyone who out there like wants to learn how to write a book one day or just like learn more about that process, I think you're the guy. So Robert, thank you for helping us understand this world a little bit.
Yeah, you need to be willing to put in probably a good 1,000 hours over the course of a couple of years. That's all you say. And I think, and again, I'm not married with kids. The amount of discipline, just like maybe diet or even exercise, you have to commit X amount of time, and you have to really treat it like as a religious exercise where, again, if you go to church every Sunday, this is what I do no matter what. Writing is that same way, because it's such a long, deep process, especially if you're writing something that's got some depth to it. You can't afford to just like, well, when I'm on the metro, I'm going to write down some notes. I mean, that's important to do too, to help you think, aggregate your thoughts. And again, the note cards are cool, but you really have to commit time, some serious time. So be prepared that this isn't a marathon; it's an Ironman for sure.
For sure. Well, Robert, thank you for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning into Capital Spotlight Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to our channels to stay updated on new releases, share the show with your friends, and rate the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. For more from Connect, subscribe to our daily newsletters, follow us on social media, and check out our website, all at Capital Connect, capital with an O, CNCT. See you next time.